Hello, this is Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 171st episode. Today, we will head to Washington, D.C. to get an insider's view of what's taking place there in banking and finance, and then widen the lens to some global trends. Timothy Adams is currently president and CEO of the Institute of International Finance. Prior to joining the IIF, Tim served as managing director of the Lindsay Group, an economic advisory firm. Previously, he served as undersecretary of U.S. Treasury for International Affairs. He also served as chief of staff to both Treasury secretaries, Paul O'Neill and John Snow. Tim Adams, a warm welcome to Kopi Time Podcast.
Yeah, it's so great to be with you. I know it's warmer there than it is here. It's a chilly, snowy day here in the nation's capital.
I gathered that. I'm actually heading to London in a few hours' time. I think the chill from the U.S., literal and metaphorical, has sort of spilled over into UK and Europe as well.
Yeah, I'm in Europe next week. Yes, bring a coat and a hat. It's winter here and there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim, I was kind of joking with you before we started the podcast that there are so many things to talk about that we could spend many, many hours. So my key struggle in this conversation would be to keep things narrow and not ramble on and drag you into all sorts of tangents. So I'll try to discipline myself as much as I can. And I'd like to bring our conversation or start our conversation by talking about the latest development in the world of central banking, the nomination of Kevin Warsh as the next Fed chair. Some thoughts.
Yeah, well, Kevin's a dear friend of mine. I was just communicating with him yesterday. I've known him for 25 years. We were colleagues when I was at Treasury, and he was at the Fed. And when we served in Bush 43 together. He was at the White House, and I was at Treasury. So I'm a huge fan. I think it was a great choice. I thought that's where the president would go. Kevin is a very politically savvy guy. He's a good communicator. He certainly served on the Fed board while as governor during a crisis time under Ben Bernanke. So he gets the institution, he gets the issues. He spent the last 15 years with Stan Druckenmiller, better understanding and fully understanding how markets function globally. And I can't think of anyone better to study under than Stan. He's one of the world's best hedge fund managers, one of the best records. And ironically, Scott Bessent also worked for the Secretary of the Treasury, also worked for Stan. So you see Stan's world, shaping U.S. policy. I think Kevin, he'll get confirmed. We just got to get through this really ridiculous issue with Jay Powell and this Department of Justice investigation, which is, I think, a waste of time. But we'll get through it. I think the White House will find a way to walk away from it. Kevin will get confirmed, and he'll be in the job by mid-year. Now, he has a huge job ahead of him. He's got he's never been a CEO. He's never been in the chair seat before. And so he's got to first build consensus around his most immediate table, which is the board. And there are three individuals who are on that board who will be skeptical, right? Barr, Jefferson, and Cook. And now, so he's got to bring them along. He's got to also build good ties with Chris Waller and Mickey Bowman, who are wonderful, dear friends of mine as well. And I think that's a given. And then Steve Moran, who's going to stay on. So he's got to build consensus around the board. He's got to convince possible detractors that he has a vision and he has a way forward. Two, then you've got the broader FOMC, and you got a tremendous number of really smart people sitting around the table. Many of you, and I know many friends of mine sitting around there. So you got to build a consensus there. And then you've got to decide what do you want to do about the organization. Kevin, has made real number of pronouncements about re-engineering the models, bringing in different economists, rethinking. I think it's a good idea to kick the tires a bit, maybe bring in different perspectives, maybe ask yourself, is there too much groupthink? I think stress testing the organization is fair. I think every new Fed chair who comes in does that. That will take time. I wouldn't worry about that immediately. I think that's a 2-year process, not a 2-month process. But his biggest short-term problem or challenge is keeping the president of the United States, off his back. And you heard the president yesterday already in a joke he made at the Alfalfa Club, which is kind of a white tie, really elite dinner here in Washington, that he would sue Kevin if he didn't cut rates. So he's got to keep the president happy, while he also has to ensure that he defends the institution and the integrity and the independence of the institution. It's going to be tough. rates are going to come down. I think he'll find a way forward. I think he'll build a consensus. But then he's just got to navigate between markets' expectation, the integrity of the institution, as well as a president who's got 3 more years left and is not shy about expressing his opinion.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about the vision aspect that you said. It's not entirely clear to me, and it seems to be the market is also sort of understanding or struggling to understand the vision that Warsh would bring, because we have seen him speak very hawkishly during the Obama years and subsequently, and then we have seen him talk very dovishly in recent years. So the politicization of the rhetoric versus, the sort of the independent thinking of Warsh as somebody, who would chair the Fed in a sort of, neutral manner. I mean, where do you think this stands up?
Well, he's going to be a pragmatist. I think whatever philosophical, tendency he harbors, I think you check them at the front door when you walk in. The institution itself will influence you. It's no matter, and I've seen a lot of people go in there as Fed governors over the time. They all have strong convictions. They're going to do A, B, and C. And then once you're inside the walls, the doors close and you're with your colleagues and staff, you become a little bit more institutionalized. And Kevin at heart is an establishment figure, right? He's not a bomb thrower, although, he gave some pretty aggressive speeches, but that was more performative, just to show that he's an independent thinker and that he has the intellectual chops to run the place. I think he's going to be very pragmatic. I think he's going to look at the facts in front of him. Then, as I said, you've got to build consensus, right? You've got to be able to get the votes around the table. So you got to find consensus. You've got to be a listener. You're a chair, but you're more of a prime minister than a president. You really are surrounded by a large number of very smart people who've already been at this. So there's a bit of Kevin's done it, but it's been 15 years. So you got a learning curve. So I think he'll be pragmatic. I think he's going to have to figure out how to get rates where they need to be in the short term, put all the other institutional stuff aside, keep the president off his back over the short term. And then philosophy will evolve over time. But I think in the near term, it's just pragmatism.
Now, you are predicting that under Warsh, rates would come down further and he would find a way to, bring the governors along with, I'm assuming, good deal of, sort of intellectual exercise. But my question to you, I want to move away from trying to parse what Mr. Warsh thinks and what you think. Do you think the U.S. economy is in dire need of lower interest rates?
No, I don't. I think, but I understand the president most certainly does and wants lower rates. And, and I don't know that the president fully appreciates the yield curve and maybe you get lower rates, at the short end of the curve, but you pay for it at the long end of the curve. And frankly, the long end of the curve is what matters most. If you think about housing, which we need to build more housing. We need a more vibrant housing market here. And in terms of just long-term funding, although U.S. government funding is pretty short-term these days, so we can set the deficit aside for a moment. No, I don't think so. But I think Kevin's going to make the case that we have this AI revolution. He already has. And I think that's what he's going to hang his hat on, that we have an AI revolution that's going on that allows you on the supply side and a huge investment-led growth trajectory, although it's very narrowly focused, investment-led, and that allows you to lower rates without creating, inflationary pressures. And I think, there's a worry that labor markets could deteriorate a bit, and could you get ahead of that? This past year, 2025, was the worst year for labor markets in a non-recessionary period since 2003. And as you saw, we lost 75,000 manufacturing jobs. I think that has less to do about monetary policy than structural policy. But nonetheless, we always look to the Fed to solve lots of problems, which is one of Kevin's complaints, right? It has been that the Fed's remit or mandate had expanded over the years. They had, as well as the many other institutions, the IIF, and central bankers got involved in lots of issues. And that's for a different conversation. So, at one point, he's going to try to narrow the focus, strict central banking. At the same time, he's going to bring in all these extraneous factors, which is the economy is transforming and revolutionizing, and we need to be cognizant of that, a la Alan Greenspan in the 1990s.
Right. So I guess that's where my biggest sort of sense of uncertainty comes, which is Warsh has been on the record saying that lower rates are warranted, and to the points that you made, that there could be a productivity-led revolution going on, and disinflationary impulse are just around the corner, so we don't have to worry about that. But at the same time, again, to your point, that he has sort of accused the Fed of having mission creep and using the balance sheet operations, the QE, to try to accomplish all those things that it should not have. How does one cut rates and do QT at the same time?
Yeah, you can't, and that's the problem. He's pretty out on over his skis on the balance sheet. And again, I think it's about being pragmatic. You got to walk in the door. You got to build a consensus. You got to show that you can lead the organization, and you got to find a way to get some easing in conditions just so the president gets off your back. The worst thing for Kevin, the worst thing for the institution, frankly, is if the president spends the next 2 years just banging away on both Kevin and the institution. That it doesn't serve anyone's purpose. So it's a balancing act. And I think Kevin does believe that he can get rates down and do so without jeopardizing price stability or the integrity of the Fed. We're going to see. He's a very savvy, very smart, sophisticated player. And so he's got a message to the president. He's got a message to markets. He's got a message to his colleagues at other central banks. I'm doing a tour through Europe next week, seeing many of his colleagues. So it's a huge, huge challenge. But he's a pretty savvy. He's a smart guy, and I think he starts off with an enormous amount of credibility.
That's good to know. Tim, he also has to worry about that other big audience, which is the bond market. Let's go with the prognostication that he will cut rates and he will do it in a somewhat credible manner. As you pointed out, he and Scott Bessent probably are on the same wavelength, so we can expect some degree of monetary fiscal coordination, especially with regards to dealing with this enormous debt. Now, let's go fast forward 9 months. The Fed has cut couple, maybe even 3 more times since Warsh became Fed chair. Market doesn't like it. The AI-led revolutionary disinflation impulse may be more of a 2028 or 2029 phenomenon, not a 26, 27 phenomenon, and the yield curve starts to steepen. What would these two gentlemen do in terms of dealing with that problem?
Yeah, that's good, and that's probably, if it were me and I were sitting over there, and that would be what would keep me up at night. Is now you got yourself in this box. How do you get out? He would need cooperation with his Treasury Secretary to give him political cover. He would have to sound more hawkish, and ultimately, you're going to have to. And this town needs to focus on our fiscal trajectory, which is harrowing and unsustainable, and no one seems to care. And so maybe that's the jolt, or no one cares until the long end backs up, mortgage rates go up, and voters start complaining, right? Maybe that's what we need in order to jolt the political class into focusing more on deficit reduction, because right now it just doesn't exist. We tinker around the edges, but let's see, I just did the math this morning. We spent 1.267 trillion on interest in the public debt over the last year, and that's $3.5 billion per day, right?
5% of GDP.
Yeah. So, it's not sustainable. We're at 120% of GDP if you look all in. If you look just debt held by the public, it's 100%. But we're an aging population. We're spending more on defense, and it just doesn't work for a lot of places. So maybe that's an opportunity for the fiscal side of this house to try to do more, or at least signal to do more. They're not ready for that, but a backup in rates does have a bit of a silver lining that maybe it focuses the political class.
Tim, assuming that the Republicans and maybe some Democrats cannot come to some sort of a fiscal consolidation path and the market starts to revolt, could we then head in the world of financial repression, a la, say, India 1970s and 80s, which is force banks to hold more bonds, get the Fed to forget about QT, start doing QE, or even like the Japanese example of yield curve control? Could we see the U.S. head into that sort of unorthodox path?
Yeah, that's a great question. I could see most certainly the president of the United States saying all those things are great. He loves price controls, and there are people around him that like price controls. And I'm sure the president, wouldn't think twice about calling up the G-SIB CEOs and saying, hey, could I sell you a few more treasuries to hold? So yes, could that come out of the White House? Most certainly. Anything can come out of this White House, right? Cap on interest rates on credit cards that just popped out of nowhere. Would Scott Bessent and the more adults in the room sign on? I don't know. I doubt it. So you could see some tension within the administration. The president is out, fielding lots of different provocative ideas, and then the secretary is going to have to walk it back from the markets, and then ultimately the Fed might have to reverse course and prove its mettle. If the markets lose confidence in this institution, the Fed's institution, its integrity, its bona fides and price stability, then getting that back will be hard. And that's where I think Kevin's got a real challenge. How do you keep the markets happy and confident that you're the right guy and you're going to protect price stability at the same time you got the president, breathing down your neck on a daily basis?
And to your point that Scott Bessent, who has dealt with the bond market in his professional career, may not get along with those things. So, again, I'm just trying to sort of game out the possible scenarios here. Could we then see the tension between, two appointed, top secretaries, or one chairman and one secretary, and the president, and then could we see things like what we saw in Trump 1.0, resignations or firings and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. This administration is very different than 1.0. This administration is much more cohesive, and they're all deeply on board with the president. So I think what happens, there's not really much of an internal policymaking process. There's no deputies process. It gets played out in social media more than anything. I think what you could see is the president tabling lots of ideas, the secretary trying to walk them back, lots of public discourse, and behind the scenes them trying to fix the problem. And then Kevin's going to get stuck in the middle. I don't think the secretary's going anywhere. I think he likes his job. I think he's here for the foreseeable future. So I don't know. It's unlike Trump 1.0, where many of those officials, the president didn't have a lot of confidence in. He didn't think they were loyalists. All these people seem pretty darn loyal. So it would take a high bar for him to start pushing people out the door.
Okay. Nobody's going to resign. They will carry out what we have sort of, gamed out, which is first cut rates. If those curves steepen, do financial repression. But Tim, there's no free lunch. Something's got to give, and I guess that will be the dollar.
Yeah, there is no free lunch, although this town operates on the idea that there is one, right? And that's what you hear on tariffs. And I love the Wall Street Journal editorial page today came back
and
sort of picked apart the president's points on tariffs. We're in a world where facts don't seem to matter anymore. And so it really is trying to figure out the truth. And, to your point, I think there is a belief, certainly in the dominant political class in this town, that it's a free lunch until there isn't. And when there isn't, whether it's on, deficit spending or geopolitical saber rattling, something is going to go wrong somewhere along the way. And then it remains to be seen how they're going to react to it. But so far, they've been incredibly lucky. Everything is priced to perfection. Will it stay that way forever? And my history says it won't.
If indeed the dollar is the pressure valve and has substantial downside, again, it seems to me that given what Scott Bessent has said recently, and you hear it from the likes of Stephen Moran all the time, that a weak dollar is actually a solution to the US's current deficit, perpetual current deficit issue, or restoring manufacturing competitiveness, and so on. So is this going to be the first administration in a very, very long time to actually guide the dollar lower?
Great question. I think if you were asked Donald Trump that question, he'd say, yes, I want a weaker dollar. I like a weaker dollar. That's his mindset. And there's some people in this administration. I think Scott Bessent is smart enough to know that if you overplay I'm going to steer it in a direction, you could lose control and you lose your credibility. So he was pretty quick to come out last week and say, no, I have a strong dollar policy. And I will say last year he spoke at our event. He called me up and said, I want to speak at the IIF spring meetings. We did. And he spoke about his commitment to the Bretton Woods institutions. And he said, look, the first question you should ask me is about the dollar. And I did. And he said, reaffirm. So I think what you're going to have, again, is this tension between 1500 Pennsylvania Avenue and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. 1500 is where the Secretary of the Treasury's building is. and the president probably pushing for a weaker dollar, and Scott the secretary trying to figure out how to modulate that in a way where it doesn't sound like that they're giving up on a strong dollar, which means nothing and everything. It depends on the administration. And for us, it was always a commitment that we wouldn't use the currency for regular neighbor policy. It really was. We have a flexible exchange rate for a reason. It goes up, it goes down. Markets determine it. Flows push it one way, push another. Relative growth, relative inflation, relative productivity. But we're not going to use it to gain market share for regular neighbor. And that's what Bessent's going to have to say. Look, it depreciates. It's a normal course of business. It was overvalued. You can ask, they'll trot out a number of people, say it's too high for too long. But he'll have to say, but that our goal is not to weaken it to the point that it's a policy lever or a tool. And then the question is, the markets believe him? And I don't know. It remains to be seen.
Tim, I had the pleasure of attending that event, and you did a fantastic job interviewing the secretary. I basically, if I remember correctly, when you had asked him the question, he said that for me, strong dollar means that the U.S. remains an attractive place for investors from all over the world, meaning even if the dollar's value moves around a bit, as long as U.S. stock market, U.S. bond market is desirable, that's what a strong dollar policy means. And I sort of understand what he was trying to get at, that, as long as U.S. assets remain attractive, even if it sort of moves around a bit here and there, it doesn't matter. But if it goes a lot under those financial repression scenario that I'm sort of fearing might materialize, then to your point, it can go disorderly. And I don't think that's going to be good for U.S. asset markets at all.
No, and that's always the challenge sitting in the corner office at the Treasury Department is how do you ensure some stability, even if the direction is seen. It's not only for the dollar, but the yen. But there's always a variety of currencies that there's a question about volatility and is it disorderly. And so you're always worried about the need for some sort of signaling, either rhetorical signaling or some sort of market intervention, which is always a last course intervention. You really don't want to do it unless you have to, because you can't push it where the markets don't want it to go. So I do think this administration believes, and it's not inconsistent with previous administrations, that if you do everything right, as one secretary used to say, that capital's a coward, it goes where it's treated well and flees where it's treated badly, that if you create the right enabling environment, you will attract capital. Now, the president sort of takes more of a strong arm approach, which is we're going to do trade deals and you're going to invest in the United States whether you like it or not. But I think Bessent believes that with deregulation, lower energy prices, that with more pro-business environment, and there is a more pro-business environment, you've got animal spirits in the boardrooms, that's for sure. The business environment is pretty positive. That in itself will attract capital, and I think it is. I do hear a lot of concern around the world about investing in the U.S. I think it's more sentiment than anything else. But if you just look on sheer fundamentals, it's a pretty good story. And I think they're banking that they can keep telling that story, especially if you get an AI revolution and you get more investment-led growth. I think they've got a really good story to tell.
But Tim, it is absolutely remarkable that 2025, talk about price to perfection, the kind of excitement that the AI space generated and all these big deals we heard, the open AIs of the world raising money in the Middle East and Japan and elsewhere. Despite all that, FDI on aggregate, declined in the U.S. in 2025 because there's a lot of paralysis and confusion about, how certain the policy environment under this tariff will be. Tim, I can tell you one thing sitting here in Singapore is that a 15% tariff, and even if there's like a 5-10% downside, it still doesn't make sense to move manufacturing away from China or Malaysia into the U.S. 30% is not sufficient a wedge. So I guess, even more like favorable tax policy, and to your point of lower energy prices, a wide range of things are needed, but most importantly, certainty, which seems to be woefully lacking.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I've always been skeptical of this manufacturing renewal. First of all, the U.S. economy is a manufacturing powerhouse already. It's a $2.9 trillion manufacturing economy, which if it were its own economy, the manufacturing sector was its own economy, would be the 8th largest economy in the world. So and it's larger than the next 5 manufacturing sectors combined. So it's a despite the rhetoric, the hollowing out, it's a powerhouse. But I do think to move production here, and I talk to producers around the world. I especially talk to people in the auto industry because I like autos, but nothing to do with my day job. But it's expensive. You've got a whole host of other costs you have to consider. It's about the durability of the policy regime. You don't, if you're going to build a factory here with a 40-year productive life, you don't do that based on the next 36 months, right?
Exactly.
I talked to some people in the aluminum smelting business. Aluminum is essentially an electricity play, right? So you can build, it takes 7 years to build a smelter here in the United States. And it's useful life for 40 years. But if the electricity prices are 3x what the Canadians can charge, given their hydroelectric power, you're not competitive, right? And then the downstream purchasers are uncompetitive as well. So I think there's a lot of caution about outside the tech space and the data centers. I think there's a lot of caution. I think there's a lot of announcements the president keeps spouting that aren't really real. I think it's mostly PR. And we just saw it in manufacturing construction last year, which was weaker in 25 than 24. So I agree with you. I think it's tough to get firms to move here with a 40-year horizon without a greater sense of the sustainability, durability of an appropriate supportive policy regime.
Tim, we were sort of, talking about the U.S. dollar, and although I sort of breached my promise, I took you on a tangent. Just want to come back to the dollar question. In addition to, where the dollar goes, there is this issue of the weaponization of the dollar, and this is something that regimes in the last 10 years, Biden or Trump, have repeatedly done that, whether it is, seizing the reserves of Central Bank of Afghanistan or Russia, or SWIFT-related sanctions for companies dealing with entities list companies and so on. So is this serious damage? Is this going to substantially, almost like a permanent basis, reduce the desirability of holding the dollar?
I hear it everywhere I go. Right, every complaint. And as we rewire and rethink of what the payment rails of the 21st century look like, tokenized deposits, tokenized assets, distributed ledger technology that is employed by central banks for central bank money and commercial bank money in terms of cross-border payments, the world is changing rapidly. And what you do see are certain jurisdictions looking to build their own systems, either cross-border or within regions. You see it in Asia, to look for ways to avoid clearing through U.S. institutions and using the dollar. It's really hard to do. 80% of commodities are still priced in dollars. 90% of FX transactions are still dollar-based. It's still a large capital market. You're still a quarter of the global economy. Still 60% of global reserves, and the next reserve currency is probably the euro, and a third of that. So there's an embedded network effect, which is really hard to dislodge. But yes, from a sentiment perspective, I hear it everywhere I go. We want to avoid the long reach of U.S. government, and we're looking for ways to do it. And over time, I think you will see jurisdictions finding ways to circumnavigate the U.S. I just don't think it's the next 3 to 5 years.
Right. But is there a more constructive engagement by the next administration can codify that dollar will not be weaponized in the future, or we've just passed over big on that one?
Well, that's a great question. I think what happens, sanctions are really a really attractive tool, right? It's a non-kinetic way of expressing and exercising U.S. power. And so it is really tough to walk away once you've seen it from every administration, Bush, Obama, Biden, Trump. It's pretty hard to give up that tool in your toolbox. I do think you could have a rhetorical approach that is a little bit more understanding of the concerns around the world and have a high threshold of when you're going to use that tool. I think that would be helpful. Right now, there's a sense they'll use it whenever they want, however they want. And that seems in many jurisdictions reckless. That's not my description per se, but I do hear it. But that you could walk that back a bit. But I don't think that any future administration is going to give up the capacity or the leverage as long as it exists.
All right. So it will remain weaponized. About 8 months ago, the Genius Act.
Let me just add to that. An interesting episode in the last couple of weeks. Secretary Bessent was out for dinner, and somehow some advocacy group got wind of it and showed up at the restaurant and made a big fuss. It was, it's on YouTube. You can find it, and it was about sanctions. And the group that was, and I didn't ever heard of the group who were shouting at him over his dinner about the use of sanctions, and it had killed 600,000 children around the world or something. It's the first time I'd ever heard protesting about U.S. sanctions. There's a lot of things you could protest about in the United States right now, but I thought that was an interesting data point. And so maybe that's to your point as well. There is concern about the aggressive use of weaponizing the dollar. And if enough of this happens, then you may see over time some sensitivity to how it's used and where it's used and under what circumstances.
That's fascinating to hear that. I'm really glad that you added that insight. Thank you for that. So related to the dollar, 8 months ago, Genius Act, stable coins. And at that moment, there was like breathless commentary that this is soon going to become like $1 trillion market. It will disintermediate countries that don't pursue serious FX stabilization policy. It would democratize, movement of currency around the world. It doesn't seem to be that big of a game changer. Or am I speaking too soon?
Well, there's certainly ambitions in this town about the future of stablecoins and their use globally, and there is, you can't really spend time with U.S. officials that it isn't often mentioned, right? And also members of Congress who are enthusiastic. So, in the tech sector, so you have this, melding of the Silicon Valley types, venture capital types, U.S. government officials, and some members of Congress who have cheerleaded this, and it is pretty transformed. The U.S. Congress hasn't done much in this term, but they did pass the Genius Act, and they're looking at something called the Clarity Act, which will give greater structure when more specific role of the SEC versus CFTC, and a host of other things, which is being debated in Washington this week. I think this administration thinks, and many in this town think, that this is the future, this is just the beginning, and they're going to continue pushing it. And as you know, the U.S. has the chair of the G20 this year, the chair of the G7 next year, and this is a topic on the G20 agenda from the U.S. perspective that they hope to push. They hope to export this regulatory regime to other countries. Now, I've talked to lots of other countries, including Singapore. The MAS, as you know, incredibly smart, one of the best in the business, and there's a lot of we'll think about it, but probably not. So I think there's a real tough sales job this administration has in front of it. That doesn't mean there aren't jurisdictions who say, oh, the Genius Act looks great. Let's take it, let's import it, let's pass it, and let's replicate the stablecoin world. And I think you will see some of that coming. Is it going to be a $1 trillion, $2 trillion, $3 trillion market? I don't know, but it's going to be larger than what it is. But I think there are limits. We're more focused on how do you tokenize assets and central bank and commercial bank money. I think that's limitless, and it's within the current system, and it includes the central banks. And I think it's very difficult to have a new payment system unless the central banks are part of it. You can remember the Diem and Libra exercise by Meta. I think if you don't have central bankers as a part of the discussion, you face real constraints. Now, the libertarian tech bros will say, who cares? It's this, we're going to burn down the world, down with the central banks. This is about liberation. Yeah, until, you start having money laundering problems, and you've got a whole host of other challenges. So yes, the Genius Act stablecoins is huge here. It's talked about daily. I think it has some upside potential. I think there are limitations. I think more is happening. I think there's alternative systems that I think are more durable and larger.
Tim, I'm just going to share my personal thought on this issue is that, and this draws on a conversation I had with BIS's Augustine Carstens a few years ago.
Yeah.
And Augustine said to me that, stable coins are a 500-year-old idea because the Dutch East India Company used to have copper-backed coins that they would, issue. And that lasted for a while, but then they started, reducing the amount of copper that they were backing it with. And once that word got out, the whole thing collapsed. His basic point was that unless you have airtight governance, these sort of, asset-backed currencies don't work very well, and we've seen that through history. And I sort of thought of that when Genius Act got passed because it was very light on regulation, and that, in my view, is the original sin. That if you don't have super tight governance at the very inception, people around the world would have a hard time using it because they feel that any private company can come up with very loosely regulated issuance of stable coins, and we don't really know how well it's governed. What are your thoughts on that?
Without question, I think governance is a huge issue, unless you want to use it because of governance light, right? And I agree with you. Augustine's, we used to, the Romans used to cut the edges of the silver, and it was silver washed rather than, yes, history is replete with examples of the debasement of currencies. And just because it's on a blockchain doesn't mean it's not subject to the same laws of gravity, right? I just think there is a market out there. How large, I don't know. We need to better understand what it looks like in a stressed environment. Andrew Bailey is the chair of the FSB, and also his role at the Bank of England is certainly looking at this. The BIS, you mentioned Augustine, Pablo DeCos, and the current BIS crowd certainly looking at this. And then there's the issue about the impact in emerging markets where there may be banks where there's semi-dollarized emerging markets. Might you see deposit flight in a stressed environment out of banks into stablecoins? And does that exacerbate financial instability in emerging markets? And might it happen with a speed that we've never quite witnessed before, like as in minutes rather than hours or days? So I think all these and we're spending a tremendous amount of time here thinking through all these scenarios simply because it is now becoming much more widely circulated, and many of our firms are interested.
Absolutely, and I gotta tip my hat. I mean, both you guys at IIF as well as the BIS, I think they're doing really, really important work. Sometimes it is at the private sector and multilateral level you want the leadership because the governments are going to follow very narrow objectives of their own country or own national interests. But since you mentioned the phrase financial stability several times, so let me sort of ask you about that. We're having this conversation at a time that we have seen rather anomalous developments, gold heading to 5,500 and then crashing a bit, although it's still exceptionally pricey. Same with silver. We're seeing the sort of the AI stock massive rally over the last couple of years and some correction going on. Does this give you circa 2000 or circa 2008 vibes, or you think this is a much better founded upcycle in asset prices?
Well, my job is to worry. And whenever we start talking about the end of the business cycle, it makes me very nervous. I still have my pets.com puppet. I have it at home as a reminder. In January of 2000, pets.com dominated the Super Bowl advertising. It was had a market cap that exceeded all the other individual industrial companies. And in March, the NASDAQ popped, and by October, they were bankrupt. So things can move pretty fast. It's interesting. I just look at metals. I'm on a foundation board. We met Tuesday night, and I was one of the ones that 6 months ago had suggested selling out of gold because I thought it was time to sell. And some of my colleagues were chiding me that we should have ridden that horse longer. And I thought, look, you can't get greedy, and I don't get it. I think looking at it. If you look at gold, any historical ratios were there. And silver is an oddity because it's an industrial metal. And we've seen massive swings just today. I think we're down 15%.
Right.
Bitcoin is down to below 70,000. So a lot of these things make me very nervous. My children, I've tried to get them to build their own portfolios, and they've been calling me this week. And I said, look, just be really conservative. Go for value stocks. Look for companies that are blue chip dividend paying. Look for companies that can get you through the cycle. and just don't get greedy. Things are priced to perfection, and maybe it all works out. The AI space is so remarkable, but there's also a tremendous amount of hype, and I don't know. I don't know if one of these firms or two of these firms will end up looking like the BlackBerry of the AI world, and you have some new technology that comes out of China or somewhere else where you can do 85% of what the LLMs can do at 5% of the cost, and that the business model for some of these entities that are going to borrow and spend hundreds of billions of dollars, that business model sort of disappears overnight, and then you got a challenge, because this market is very narrowly focused, very intense, very narrowly focused. As you know, it's 7 or 8 companies, and it's very focused on a particular aspect of investment. I would feel better if it were more broad-based.
Right. So I guess you and I should both welcome the fact that we're actually seeing a bit of a rotation as opposed to just a brutal sell-off, that people are getting into the value stock. So they're listening to your advice, Tim.
Yeah, well, I hope. I'd like to see this broaden out, widen a bit, and become much more durable. But there's no doubt there's a technological transformation going on. I was just looking at some videos of some of the new humanoid robots. They were all over Davos. But I found one this morning that can wash the dishes, do your laundry, and walk your dog, which is pretty nice given how cold it is here. I could have someone walk my dog. But there's no doubt there's a technological revolution that's happening before our very eyes. But there's no doubt that firms will survive and others won't, as we saw in the 1990s, right? Think about all the search engines that existed in 1996, right, that didn't exist 4 years later. And so out of that, some of these companies will be the next Googles and Amazons, and some won't be around.
I confess using Lycos and Excite and all those search engines back in those days.
Ask Jeeves.
Tim, we've largely focused on the U.S. You run Institute of International Finance, and you produce very, very good data on capital flow. I'm an avid consumer of your capital tracker report and the data that comes up with it. Let's sort of leave the U.S. aside for a second and just talk about global flows trends. And from your vantage point, IIF, what's your sense? Have we survived the worst? Have we been stress tested pretty well? Is the outlook okay?
Well, as you know, we are global. We have offices around the world, including a wonderful office there in downtown Singapore, just a few blocks away. We just did a big event in Beijing a week ago. We had a team out that was across China for an entire week. So we spend our time in many, many different countries around the world. So let's think about, I'm off to Europe. You said you were going as well. Europe is an interesting story. I saw the German numbers out this morning, better than expected. A lot of spending occurring in Germany. A lot of spending is going to occur across the continent in terms of defense spending. We actually just launched a whole working group on how defense spending will occur, how it's coordinated, what it means for financial institutions, what are the risks, what are the upsides. Everywhere I've been in the last 90 days, discussion about defense spending in national security has come up, from Greenland to Poland, right? So Europe has great challenges. It's like the U.S. aging population, challenging demographics, social safety net, which is incredibly expensive. They're going to spend more on defense. They desperately need institutional change. They need a continent-wide capital market so they can better intermediate capital, get it out of savings accounts that have zero returns, and build an equity culture. So they all know what to do, and I'm going to repeat next week what they need to do, and they're going to tell me they know what to do. It's really not, Mario Draghi's done a good job of outlining. It's all about execution, and maybe some of this can sort of inch ahead over time. Probably needs some governance reform. So I'm somewhat optimistic about Europe, but not overly so. I think certainly there's a lot of spending that's going to happen. It's going to keep dragging them along. One thing I have seen about the Gulf and Asia, and I spent a lot of time in the GCC in December, is the interest in the Gulf, in ASEAN and Asia generally, the interest in ASEAN countries in the Gulf, in Africa. And it's part of my theme of the world is rewiring itself. We used to optimize for efficiency. Now I think we're optimizing for resiliency. And I think there's a lot of investors in terms of capital flows are looking not leaving the U.S., but they're looking for alternatives, and they're looking for ways to diversify from the U.S. So, many of our GCC firms were in Singapore in September. They're going to Hong Kong. The ASEAN countries are in the Gulf. Throw in India and Africa. You have this arc that goes, also throw in Europe, that goes from the GCC across India into Asia. Now throw in Australia. I've got to go there in a few weeks. I think that's the future. I think it's incredibly dynamic. You got 500 million middle-class consumers. I think it's an enormous amount of upside potential and a tremendous amount of investment. So I think the world is rewiring itself. That makes me somewhat bullish about that arc that I just described. And then I think more generally, EMs, those with good policy regimes attract capital, and those who don't, right? And there's good stories to be told on a heterogeneous individual basis. We got a huge number of elections in Latin America, and you see right of center governments coming in, which just in Costa Rica this past week. And you may see better policy regimes going forward. And maybe, depending on what happens in Venezuela, you have a model of transitioning from 3 decades of bad policy to maybe something better. So I'm optimistic that we'll end up with a world that's better distributed, more diversified, less dependent on the U.S. consumer as the consumer in last resort, and ultimately less dependent on China as the supplier of capital goods and consumer goods around the world. That's the next piece that needs to evolve, and I think it will over time. So I'm optimistic about a more balanced, diversified global economy. It's heterogeneous, but I'm very excited about this GCC to the ASEAN arc, as I call it.
Well, we are too. Finally, Tim, you were at Davos. Mark Carney gave quite the speech. It's resonated around the corridors of non-superpower countries around the world. What did you make of it, and what do you think of its call?
Yeah, Mark is a great friend. We have known each other for years, and I sent him a nice handwritten note when I got back. I saw him give the speech. I thought it was spot on. I think it was a wake-up call. Mark's always, he was a hockey player and as a young guy and he was on the hockey team at Harvard. Yeah, so the adage is you want to be where the puck's going, right? I think Mark's always where the puck is going. And I think it was an important wake-up call he described them as middle powers. I don't know if I like that phrase, but I don't have a better term, that the world has changed. The old order is gone. I don't know what comes next. I've talked to a number of theorists, political scientists, historians, authors over the past few weeks, and everyone's got a different sort of view of, is this transitional to something new, some new equilibrium, geopolitical equilibrium, or are we just going to wander through the wilderness for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years? I don't know the answer to that. I just know what we had is gone, and every country now needs to figure out how to defend itself, how to optimize its own national security, how to develop new alliances, new friends, new supply chains. It's a bit of a dog eat dog world out there. And I think Mark's view was we're not going to be left behind. We've got enormous resources where we have enormous innovation, ingenuity, and we're not the US, we're not China, but we can certainly find new markets, new alliances, and new places to do business. We don't have to share every value. And I think that re-scrambling is happening and will happen for months, if not many years, maybe decades to come.
I call it the global anti-bullying campaign.
Yeah, it is. Well, I hear it everywhere I go. And if your listeners haven't read the speech, Mark's speech, so they should. I think it really is. Here's where we are. You can't cry over. It is what it is, right? You de-emotionalize it. Just move on. It's just be pragmatic. Well, I'll finish where I started. Be pragmatic and figure out how to build resiliency in the system and defend your interests. And then and we'll see what happens. And hopefully some new order evolves that promotes prosperity and peace, and that we're all better off for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim, this was such a great conversation. Can't thank you enough for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I always look forward to you do fabulous work. I read everything you write. So thank you for having me. I look forward to coming back.
Brilliant. Thanks to our listeners as well. This podcast was produced by Ken Delbridge at Splice Studios. Violet Lee and Daisy Sharma provided additional assistance. Kopi Time is for information only and does not constitute any investment advice. All 171 episodes of the series are available on YouTube and on all major platforms, including Apple and Spotify. For our research content and webinars, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.